Winter, 1941, Central Russia. The German Sixth Army was being bled white by Soviet counterattacks that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Temperatures had plunged to 40 degrees below zero. Men were freezing to death in their foxholes. Engines refused to start. Weapons jammed. And from the white emptiness of the steppe, wave after wave of Soviet T-34 tanks were rolling toward German positions like steel avalanches. On an improvised airfield carved from frozen ground, mechanics worked frantically to prepare aircraft that had never been designed for such conditions. Ice crystals formed on wings, hydraulic fluid thickened into sludge, engines that had roared to life in the warmth of summer now coughed and died in the Siberian cold. But these aircraft had to fly. Because 20 miles to the east, Soviet tank columns had smashed through German defensive lines and were driving hard toward this very airfield. The aircraft waiting on that frozen field were Junkers Ju-87 Stukas, two-seat dive bombers with inverted gull wings and fixed landing gear that made them look like prehistoric birds of prey. They were slow, they were vulnerable. By 1941, military analysts in London and Washington had already written them off as obsolete death traps. The Battle of Britain had proven they couldn't survive against modern fighters, yet here they were, in the depths of a Russian winter, being asked to do the impossible. Stop a Soviet breakthrough, save an entire army group, buy time for reinforcements that might never come. The pilot who would lead this desperate mission was a 25-year-old Oberleutnant named Hans Ulrich Rudel. He had been flying Stukas for less than a year. He had barely survived his training period, having been declared unsuitable for combat flying due to his inability to master dive bombing techniques. His instructors thought he was clumsy. His commanding officers doubted he would survive his first combat mission. They were spectacularly wrong. Over the next 3 days, Rudel and his Stuka squadron would fly mission after mission against the advancing Soviet tanks. They would attack in conditions that should have grounded all aircraft. They would face anti-aircraft fire so intense it turned the sky black with shrapnel, and they would stop the Soviet breakthrough cold, destroying enough tanks to buy the time the German army needed to establish new defensive positions. This is the story of how an obsolete dive bomber became the most effective anti-tank weapon on the Eastern Front. How a handful of pilots flying aircraft that shouldn't have worked performed miracles that saved armies, and how terror from the sky stopped Soviet breakthroughs in their tracks. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka was born from desperation and copied from America. In 1933, Ernst Udet, a German World War I fighter ace, who had survived the meat grinder of aerial combat with 62 confirmed kills, travelled to the United States. He was officially there as a civilian pilot and aerobatic performer. In reality, he was scouting American aviation technology for a German military that was secretly rearming in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. In Cleveland, Ohio, Udet witnessed something that would change the course of aerial warfare. American Navy pilots were demonstrating the Curtiss Helldiver, a biplane dive bomber that could place bombs with unprecedented accuracy. While conventional bombers flying level at altitude were lucky to hit within 100 yards of their target, these dive bombers were consistently landing bombs within 10 yards. Udet was mesmerized. He saw immediately what such precision could mean for supporting fast-moving ground forces. He flew one of the American dive bombers himself and returned to Germany, convinced that this was the future of tactical air support. But Udet faced opposition. General Wolfram von Richthofen, cousin of the legendary Red Baron and head of the Luftwaffe's developmental section, argued that dive bombers were suicide machines. He pointed out the obvious vulnerabilities. To deliver a bomb accurately, the aircraft had to dive nearly vertically toward the target, approaching to within 3,000 feet or less before releasing its payload. During this dive, the aircraft was essentially a sitting duck, vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire from below and unable to evade attacking fighters. After releasing the bomb, the pilot had to pull out of the dive, a maneuver that subjected him to crushing G-forces that could cause blackouts. And the aircraft had to be heavily built to withstand the stress of these vertical dives, which made it slow and unmaneuverable in level flight. Von Richthofen wanted fast, multi-engine bombers that could speed away from danger. Udet wanted precision weapons that could work directly with tank columns, destroying strong points and obstacles in real time. The debate raged through 1933 and 1934. In the end, Udet won, largely because Hitler himself was convinced by demonstrations of the concept. The Führer saw dive bombers as flying artillery that could support his planned blitzkrieg tactics. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, gave Udet the authority to develop Germany's dive bomber force. The Junkers Company had been experimenting with dive bomber design since the late 1920s. Working in Sweden to avoid treaty restrictions, they had developed the K-47, a prototype that incorporated many innovative features. Hermann Pohlmann, the chief designer, created something that looked nothing like the sleek fighters of the era. The Ju-87 prototype that first flew in 1935 was angular, ungainly, almost brutal in its functionality. It had inverted gull wings that gave the pilot excellent visibility downward during dives. It had fixed landing gear with massive wheel fairings called spats that made it look like it was wearing boots. It was slow, with a maximum speed of barely 240 miles per hour. But it could do something no other aircraft could do. It could dive at angles exceeding 80 degrees, place bombs with surgical precision, and pull out of the dive automatically even if the pilot blacked out from G-forces. The key innovation was the automatic dive brake system. When the pilot initiated his attack dive and pulled the dive brake lever, 2 large perforated panels would deploy under each wing. These created massive drag that limited the aircraft's speed during the dive and ensured a predictable pullout. If the pilot lost consciousness from the 7 G-forces experienced during recovery, the aircraft's control column would automatically pull back at a predetermined altitude, leveling the aircraft and saving the pilot's life. It was a brilliant piece of engineering that turned a high-risk maneuver into something that could be performed repeatedly by average pilots. But the feature that would make the Stuka legendary had nothing to do with its combat capability. It was a psychological weapon. Mounted on the leading edge of the landing gear were ram air sirens called Jericho trumpets. As the Stuka dove toward its target, these sirens produced a rising, screaming wail that could be heard for miles. The sound was designed to freeze enemy soldiers in terror, to make them cower in their trenches instead of manning their weapons. German propaganda would later claim this was Ernst Udet's idea. In reality, it probably emerged from testing when mechanics noticed the strange sounds produced during high-speed dives. Someone realized this could be weaponized. The first combat test came in Spain. In 1937, Germany sent a contingent of aircraft and pilots called the Condor Legion to support Francisco Franco's nationalist forces during the Spanish Civil War. The Jersey Seveners that arrived in Spain were the A model, underpowered and still working out technical problems. But in Spain, where the Republican forces had limited anti-aircraft capability and virtually no modern fighters, the Stukas could operate with relative impunity. They performed with devastating effectiveness. Bridges that had stood for centuries were destroyed with single bombs. Artillery positions were obliterated before they could fire a shot. Troop concentrations were scattered by attacks that seemed to come from nowhere. Most importantly, the pilots learned. They discovered that the Stuka could place bombs within 15 feet of a target when flown by a skilled pilot. They developed tactics for coordinating with ground forces, using coloured smoke to mark targets and radio communications to direct attacks in real time. They learned to approach from different angles to confuse anti-aircraft gunners, and they discovered the psychological impact of their screaming dives. Republican soldiers, hearing that distinctive wail, would abandon their positions and run. The terror was as effective as the explosives. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, starting World War II, the Stukas had been refined into the B model. More powerful engines, better visibility, improved bomb loading mechanisms, and those screaming sirens now standard equipment. The Polish campaign showed what coordinated blitzkrieg warfare could achieve. German panzer divisions would advance rapidly, supported by Stukas that destroyed any obstacle in their path. Polish artillery batteries that opened fire were obliterated within minutes by Stuka attacks. Bridges that Polish engineers tried to demolish were captured intact because Stukas destroyed the demolition teams before they could act. Polish troop trains were caught in the open and annihilated. The campaign lasted barely a month. The Stuka had proven itself the perfect weapon for supporting fast-moving armoured warfare. France fell even faster. In May 1940, German forces invaded France and the Low Countries. At the Battle of Sedan, Stukas performed 300 sorties in a single day, pulverising French defensive positions and allowing German armour to cross the Meuse River. The breakthrough that resulted cut the Allied armies in half and led directly to the evacuation at Dunkirk. During that evacuation, Stukas attacked the beaches and the ships offshore, turning the withdrawal into a nightmare of explosions and fire. The French army, the British Expeditionary Force, and the world watched in horror as these screaming dive bombers seemed capable of destroying anything they chose to attack. But at Dunkirk, the first cracks in the Stuka's invincibility appeared. Royal Air Force fighters, particularly Spitfires and Hurricanes, discovered that the slow-moving Stukas were easy prey if caught during their attack dives or recovery climbs. British pilots developed tactics of waiting above the Stukas, then diving on them as they pulled out of their bombing runs when they were most vulnerable, slow and predictable in their flight path. The Germans lost dozens of Stukas in the skies over Dunkirk. It was a warning of what would come. The Battle of Britain would break the myth of Stuka invincibility forever. Hermann Göring, convinced that the Stukas could destroy Britain's radar stations with their legendary precision, committed them to attacks against the chain-home radar network in August 1940. The results were catastrophic. On August 13th, the Luftwaffe launched its largest attack yet. Stukas attacked radar stations along the English coast. RAF fighters were waiting. The carnage was immediate and total. Spitfires with 350 mph speed advantages simply accelerated past the lumbering Stukas and ripped them apart with 8 machine guns. Hurricanes attacked from ahead where the Stukas had no forward-firing guns and minimal armour protection. August 18th, 1940, became known as the hardest day. That afternoon, Flight Lieutenant Frank Carey led 9 Hawker Hurricanes head-on into a large formation of Stukas, attempting to attack a radar station at Poling. Carey later described the attack. He simply flew straight at the Stuka formation and opened fire. The first Stuka he engaged stood straight up on its nose with flames pouring from it. The British pilots destroyed 16 Stukas in that single engagement. It was a massacre. By the end of August, the Luftwaffe had lost 59 Stukas destroyed and 33 damaged in just 6 weeks over Britain. The losses were unsustainable. The Stuka was withdrawn from operations over England. Military analysts in Britain and America declared the Stuka obsolete. It couldn't survive against modern fighters. Its slow speed made it vulnerable. Its lack of maneuverability was a death sentence when enemy fighters appeared. The dive bomber concept itself was questioned. Why risk pilots and aircraft in near-vertical dives when conventional bombers could attack from altitude with far less risk? The British declared the Stuka finished as an offensive weapon. They were wrong. They were judging the Stuka in a role it was never designed for, strategic bombing against defended targets in contested airspace. That wasn't what the Stuka was built to do. It was built to support ground forces, to destroy tanks and artillery and strongpoints. And in that role, particularly on the Eastern Front where the war would be decided, the Stuka was about to prove its worth in ways no one could have imagined. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. 3 million German soldiers, 3,500 tanks, and over 2,000 aircraft smashed into Soviet positions along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The Soviet Air Force, caught by surprise with aircraft lined up wingtip to wingtip on their airfields, was virtually destroyed on the ground in the first days of the war. Over 2,100 Soviet aircraft were destroyed on June 22 alone. This created exactly the conditions where the Stuka excelled. Uncontested airspace and targets of opportunity as far as the eye could see. Approximately 500 Stukas participated in the initial assault. They ranged ahead of the advancing panzer divisions, destroying Soviet command posts, ammunition dumps, and troop concentrations. Soviet soldiers gave them new nicknames: the musician for the screaming sirens, the screecher, the Black Death. Soviet commanders who tried to organize defensive positions found them obliterated by Stuka attacks before they could be manned. Soviet tank columns attempting counterattacks were caught on the road and destroyed. The psychological impact was devastating. Soviet soldiers, hearing the Stuka sirens, would abandon their positions and flee. Even seasoned troops who had fought bravely in previous campaigns broke and ran when the Stukas appeared. But the vast distances of Russia created new problems. Airfields that were close to the front in the morning were 100 miles behind by evening, as German forces advanced. Stukas operating from these fields could barely reach the battle, before having to turn back for fuel. Makeshift forward airfields were established, nothing more than flattened fields with fuel trucks and ammunition, but these could be overrun by Soviet counterattacks, and the Stukas themselves were wearing out. The D model that arrived in 1941 and 1942 had a more powerful engine, better range and improved armor, but it was still fundamentally the same slow-dive bomber that had been shot out of the sky over Britain. Hans-Ulrich Rudel arrived on the Eastern Front in June 1941 as part of Sturzkampfgeschwader II, Immelmann Wing. He was 25 years old, a fanatical Nazi who didn't drink or smoke and was obsessed with physical fitness. His training had been troubled. He had repeatedly failed to master the dive bombing technique, approaching his targets too fast or releasing his bombs too late. His instructors considered him unsuitable for combat. Only his persistence and political connections kept him in the program. When he finally arrived at his first combat unit, his squadron mates viewed him as a liability. They expected him to get himself killed quickly and hoped he wouldn't take anyone with him. Rudel's first missions were reconnaissance flights. He flew as an observer, studying the ground, learning to read terrain and identify targets. It was boring work that kept him away from the real action, but it gave him something invaluable. Time to understand the battlefield. He learned to spot camouflaged Soviet positions. He understood how Soviet forces moved and where they concentrated. And he studied the veterans, watching how the successful pilots approached their targets, how they managed their dives, how they escaped after their attacks. On September 23, 1941, Rudel participated in an attack that would make him famous throughout Germany. The Soviet Baltic Fleet, trapped in Kronstadt harbour near Leningrad, included the battleship Murat, a 23,000-ton behemoth mounting 12-inch guns that were bombarding German positions. Multiple attacks on the Murat had failed. The ship was heavily armoured and defended by intense anti-aircraft fire. But when 1,000-kilogram bombs, each weighing 2,200 pounds, arrived at the wing, Rudel's commander decided to try again. Rudel volunteered to lead the attack. The approach to Kronstadt was a killing ground. Soviet anti-aircraft batteries filled the sky with exploding shells. 3 Stukas were shot down on the approach. Rudel pressed on, diving through the flak, focusing on the battleship below. At 300 meters altitude, barely 1,000 feet, he released his bomb and immediately pulled into a steep climb. The bomb struck the Murat near the forward magazine. The resulting explosion cracked the 600-foot warship in half, killing 326 men and sinking the vessel in shallow water. Rudel struggled to regain control of his aircraft after blacking out from the G-forces and managed to pull up just 12 feet above the water. Soviet fighters immediately attacked the withdrawing Stukas. Rudel made it back. He was awarded the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest award for valour. He was suddenly a national hero. But he had no time to enjoy his fame, because the Eastern Front was about to turn into a nightmare. The German advance had carried deep into Russia by December 1941. German spearheads were within sight of Moscow. The Wehrmacht had destroyed entire Soviet armies, capturing millions of prisoners. Victory seemed inevitable. Then winter arrived, and with it, the Soviet counteroffensive. Stalin had been moving reserve armies from Siberia, fresh troops equipped for winter warfare. On December 5th, these forces struck. Along the entire front, Soviet armies attacked, and they attacked with tanks. The T-34, a medium tank that combined sloped armour, a powerful 76mm gun, and excellent mobility, was superior to most German tanks. Worse, the Soviets had thousands of them. German forces, exhausted and frozen, struggled to hold positions. In many sectors, the defensive lines simply collapsed. This was when the Stuka units learned what they were truly capable of. At an airfield in central Russia, mechanics worked through the night in temperatures that froze exposed flesh in minutes, preparing Stukas for missions that shouldn't have been possible. Engines had to be kept running or heated with fires. Hydraulic lines had to be checked constantly because the fluid was thickening in the cold. Bombs had to be warmed so their fuses would function. The pilots slept in their aircraft to stay warm, and in the pre-dawn darkness, they took off to face the Soviet counteroffensive. The Soviet winter offensive of 1941 to 1942 saw the Immelmann wing supporting hard-pressed German defences. Rudel, now considered one of the squadron's most reliable pilots despite his earlier struggles, flew mission after mission. 4 sorties a day, 5, 6, taking off, attacking Soviet positions, landing just long enough to refuel and rearm, then taking off again. The ground crews worked miracles keeping the aircraft flying. When hydraulic fluid froze, they improvised heating systems. When engines refused to start, they hand-cranked them until they caught. When bombs hung up on frozen release mechanisms, Armourers climbed onto the wings in midwinter to manually release them. Then came the crisis that would define the Stuka's role on the Eastern Front. A Soviet tank column broke through the front lines and drove hard toward the Immelmann Wings airfield. Intelligence reported at least 50 T-34 tanks supported by infantry. They were 20 miles away and moving fast. The airfield had to be evacuated or defended. There were no German ground forces available. The nearest Wehrmacht units were engaged elsewhere. The Stukas would have to stop the Soviet breakthrough themselves. Rudel led the first attack. 6 Stukas, each carrying a 500-kilogram bomb and 450-kilogram bombs. The Soviet column was easy to find, a trail of black exhaust smoke visible for miles in the clear winter air. The tanks were moving in formation across open ground, confident that German forces were in retreat. They never expected to be attacked by aircraft in the depths of winter. Rudel rolled his Stuka into a dive from 4,000 meters. The acceleration was immediate and brutal. Wind screamed past the cockpit. The Jericho trumpets added their distinctive wail. The T-34s below scrambled, trying to scatter, but there was nowhere to go on the open steppe. Rudel released his 500-kilogram bomb at 800 meters and immediately pulled into a climb. Behind him, the bomb struck between 2 T-34s, the explosion lifting both tanks off the ground and flipping one completely over. The other 4 Stukas in his formation dove and released. More explosions, Soviet infantrymen diving for cover, tanks burning. But most of the Soviet force was still intact and still advancing. Rudel led his formation back to the airfield. They landed, taxied to the refueling area, and ground crews swarmed over the aircraft. Fuel trucks pulled alongside. Armourers wheeled bomb carts into position. The entire turnaround took 18 minutes. Then they were airborne again. For 3 days, this pattern continued. The Stukas would attack the Soviet column, destroy a handful of tanks, return for fuel and bombs, and attack again. The Soviet advance slowed but didn't stop. Soviet anti-aircraft guns appeared, turning the airspace above the column into a hell of exploding shells. 2 Stukas were shot down. 3 more were so badly damaged they couldn't fly. But the attacks continued. Rudel personally flew 17 sorties in those 3 days, more than many pilots flew in a month. His rear gunner Ernst Gaedermann manned his MG-15 machine gun through mission after mission, fighting off Soviet fighters that tried to intercept them. The turning point came on the 3rd day. The Soviet column, having lost more than 30 tanks and hundreds of soldiers to the relentless Stuka attacks, halted to regroup. They were just 10 miles from the German airfield, close enough that personnel were preparing to evacuate. But the column didn't advance. Soviet commanders, realizing that advancing meant exposing themselves to more Stuka attacks, waited for reinforcements and better air cover. That delay was fatal. German ground forces, the Waffen-SS Das Reich Division, arrived and established defensive positions. The Soviet breakthrough had been stopped, not by tanks or artillery, but by a handful of obsolete dive bombers flying impossible missions in impossible conditions. This pattern would repeat countless times over the next 3 years on the Eastern Front. Soviet forces would achieve a breakthrough. German commanders would scramble for reserves that didn't exist, and the Stukas would be called in as a fire brigade, attacking relentlessly until the breakthrough was contained. The Stukas became known as the Fire Brigade of the Eastern Front. When a crisis developed, when Soviet tanks punched through defensive lines, when German forces were about to be overrun, the Stukas appeared. Their accuracy made them more effective than conventional bombers. Their ability to operate from forward airfields meant they could respond quickly, and their psychological impact on Soviet troops, who had learned to fear the screaming sirens, was immeasurable. But by 1942, a new problem was emerging. Soviet tank production had reached incredible levels. The Soviets were building thousands of T-34 tanks every month. German forces were encountering tank formations of hundreds of vehicles. Traditional dive bombing, dropping a single 500-kilogram bomb per aircraft, wasn't sufficient. You might destroy 1 tank per sortie. Against a formation of 200 tanks, you would need 200 sorties. By the time you flew them all, the Soviet force would have advanced 50 miles. A new solution was needed. Hans Ulrich Rudel had an idea. He had been experimenting with using the Stuka's wing-mounted machine guns against tanks, approaching from behind where the armour was thinnest and firing into the engine compartment. He had managed to set several tanks on fire this way, but 7.92mm machine guns weren't powerful enough to reliably penetrate tank armour. What if the Stuka mounted cannons? Real anti-tank cannons capable of penetrating armour? The idea was radical. The Stuka was already considered heavy and underpowered. Adding the weight of cannons and ammunition would make it even slower. But Rudel persisted, and his reputation as a successful pilot gave him influence. The Luftwaffe's technical office agreed to experiment. The result was the Ju-87G, the Kanonenvogel or cannon bird. Two 37mm Flak 18 cannons, adapted from anti-aircraft guns, were mounted in pods under the wings. Each cannon had a magazine holding 6 tungsten-cored armour-piercing rounds. The cannons fired semi-automatically, 1 round per trigger pull. The entire installation added nearly half a ton of weight to the aircraft. The dive brakes were removed to save weight. The G model could no longer dive bomb. It was purely a tank killer, approaching targets at low altitude and firing its cannons in level flight. The tungsten-cored shells could penetrate any Soviet tank in service. The key was shot placement. Rudel developed specific tactics: attack from behind where the armour was thinnest, aim for the engine deck or the space between the turret and hull, fire from close range 800 metres or less to ensure penetration. A single well-placed hit could ignite a tank's fuel and ammunition, causing a catastrophic explosion that blew the turret off. Rudel practiced relentlessly, becoming incredibly accurate. He learned to fire single shots rather than bursts, conserving his limited ammunition. He discovered that attacking along the axis of German defensive lines rather than across them meant that even if his Stuka was damaged, he was flying toward friendly territory, rather than deeper into Soviet-held ground. The first combat test of the Ju-87G came in April 1943 in the Crimea. Rudel, now a Hauptmann and squadron commander, led an experimental anti-tank unit equipped with 3 of the cannon-armed Stukas. Soviet forces had established a beachhead at Kuban and were landing reinforcements by sea. Rudel's unit attacked the landing craft and support vessels, using their cannons to devastating effect. Rudel personally claimed the destruction of over 70 vessels in that operation. The 37mm shells designed to destroy aircraft tore through the thin-skinned landing craft like paper. The experiment was deemed a success. More Stukas would be converted to the G configuration. July 1943 brought the Battle of Kursk, the largest armoured battle in history. Germany had assembled 780,000 men, 2,700 tanks and assault guns, and around 2,000 aircraft for Operation Citadel, an attempt to encircle and destroy Soviet forces in the Kursk salient. The Soviets, warned of the attack by intelligence and partisan reports, had prepared layered defences with extensive minefields and anti-tank positions. When the German offensive began on July 5th, it immediately bogged down. Soviet defences were far stronger than anticipated. German tanks advanced into killing zones where pre-sighted artillery and anti-tank guns destroyed them by the dozens. The Luftwaffe, including several Stuka Geschwaders, provided massive air support, but even their intervention couldn't break the Soviet defences. On the first day of the offensive, Hans-Ulrich Rudel flew a Ju-87G in combat for the first time during a major operation. It was the first time the cannon-armed variant had been used in a large-scale battle. Rudel spotted a column of Soviet T-34 tanks moving to reinforce the defensive positions. He rolled into his attack, approaching from behind at treetop level. The first tank exploded as his shells penetrated the engine compartment. The second tank tried to evade, but Rudel tracked it and fired again. Another explosion. The Soviet tanks scattered, trying to find cover, but on the open steppe there was nowhere to hide. Rudel made multiple passes, firing single shots with each pass, conserving his precious ammunition. By the time he expended all 12 rounds and had to break off, 4 Soviet tanks were burning. He landed, rearmed, and attacked again. By the end of July 5th, Rudel personally claimed 12 Soviet tanks destroyed. 12 tanks in a single day. It was an unprecedented achievement. Ferdinand Schörner, a senior German general, commented that Rudel alone replaced a whole division. The compliment was barely an exaggeration. A full-strength panzer division might destroy 12 enemy tanks in a day of heavy fighting. Rudel had achieved the same result flying a single obsolete dive bomber. Other pilots in Rudel's squadron achieved similar results. The cannon-armed Stukas proved devastatingly effective against Soviet armour. The key was the combination of mobility and firepower. A tank destroyer on the ground was limited by terrain, could be flanked, and took time to move to new positions. The Stuka could appear anywhere, attack, and be gone before effective countermeasures could be organised. Soviet tank crews became nervous at the sound of aircraft engines, even friendly ones. They learned to scan the skies constantly. Tank commanders began requesting more anti-aircraft guns to accompany their formations. The Battle of Kursk ultimately failed. Despite achieving some penetrations of Soviet defences, German forces couldn't sustain the offensive. Soviet reserves were too deep, defensive positions too strong, and casualties too heavy. By mid-July, the offensive was called off. Germany would never again attempt a major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. But the performance of the cannon-armed Stukas had proven the concept. The Luftwaffe ordered the production of more Ju-87G variants. Existing D models were retrofitted with the cannon pods. More experienced pilots were trained in the specialised tactics required for tank hunting. For Hans-Ulrich Rudel, Kursk was just the beginning. Over the next 2 years, he would fly hundreds more missions, perfecting the art of tank destruction. By November 1943, he was credited with destroying over 100 tanks. By February 1944, he had destroyed over 200. His tactics became standard doctrine for all German tank hunting aircraft. Other pilots studied his methods and tried to replicate his success. Most couldn't match his precision, but even average pilots achieved kill ratios far beyond what conventional dive bombing could accomplish. The Soviet High Command took the threat seriously. They deployed more anti-aircraft guns with their tank formations. They instructed tank commanders to button up, closing all hatches whenever aircraft were reported. They tried to provide fighter cover for advancing tank columns. None of it was enough. The Stukas could attack from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming defensive fire. They could approach at extremely low altitude, below the minimum depression of many anti-aircraft guns, and even when damaged, the rugged Stuka could often make it back to German lines. Rudel himself was shot down 30 times by ground fire during the war. He walked away from every crash. The appearance of cannon-armed Stukas had a profound psychological impact on Soviet troops. Tank crews who had confidently advanced against German positions now hesitated, knowing that screaming death could appear from the sky at any moment. Soviet commanders began deploying tanks in dispersed formations, rather than concentrated columns, reducing their combat effectiveness but making them harder to attack from the air. Soviet soldiers interviewed after the war consistently rated German air attacks, particularly by Stukas, as one of the most terrifying experiences of the war. The combination of the screaming sirens, the suddenness of the attack, and the knowledge that there was no effective defense created a psychological burden that affected morale and combat effectiveness. By late 1943, Soviet fighter forces had recovered from their catastrophic losses in 1941 and were becoming more numerous and better trained. The slow-moving Stukas became increasingly vulnerable. Soviet Yak fighters, particularly the Yak-3 and Yak-9, were fast and maneuverable. They began hunting Stukas aggressively. Stuka losses increased dramatically. To counter this, German commanders assigned fighter escorts to Stuka formations. Messerschmitt Bf-109Ns and Fokker-Wulf FW-190s would fly top cover, engaging Soviet fighters while the Stukas attacked ground targets below. This provided some protection but consumed resources. Fighters protecting Stukas couldn't be used for other missions. In March 1944, Hans-Ulrich Rudel was leading an attack against a bridge over the Dniester River when one of his new pilots was shot down by Soviet fighters. The pilot survived the crash and Rudel saw him waving from the ground. Despite orders prohibiting such rescue attempts, Rudel landed his Stuka in a nearby field to pick up the downed crew. But his aircraft became stuck in soft mud and couldn't take off. With Soviet infantry approaching, Rudel and his crew abandoned the aircraft and ran. They covered 4 miles on foot, pursued by Soviet soldiers, reaching the Dniester River. They slid down a cliff through thorn bushes and dove into the freezing, flooded river. Rudel's rear gunner, Owen Henschel, drowned during the crossing. Rudel made it across and eventually reached German lines. He was the only member of the group to survive. The incident earned him both praise for his courage and criticism for risking valuable aircraft and crew on a rescue attempt. By late 1944, the strategic situation had deteriorated catastrophically for Germany. Soviet forces had pushed German armies back toward the pre-war borders. The Luftwaffe was running out of fuel, pilots and aircraft, but the Stukas continued flying. In fact, as the situation became more desperate, they became more important. With German ground forces outnumbered and outgunned, air support was often the only way to slow Soviet advances. Stuka units were deployed as fire brigades, rushing from crisis to crisis, attacking wherever Soviet forces threatened to break through. On February 8, 1945, Hans Ulrich Rudel's Stuka was hit by Soviet anti-aircraft fire. Shrapnel severed an artery in his right leg. He managed to fly back to German lines but nearly bled to death before receiving medical attention. Doctors amputated his right leg below the knee. For any other pilot, the war would have been over. Not for Rudel. 6 weeks later, with a hastily fitted prosthetic leg, he resumed flying combat missions. He had to have his aircraft's rudder pedal modified to accommodate his prosthetic, but he flew, and he continued destroying Soviet tanks. He claimed 26 more tanks destroyed in the final 2 months of the war, flying with one leg. The final statistics of Rudel's combat career almost defy belief. He flew 2,530 combat missions, more than any pilot in history. He claimed the destruction of 519 Soviet tanks, though this figure is disputed by historians who note the lack of primary source confirmation. He sank the battleship Marat, 2 cruisers, a destroyer, and 70 landing craft. He destroyed over 800 vehicles, 150 artillery positions, and 9 aircraft in aerial combat. He was shot down 30 times, and never once by an enemy fighter, always by ground fire. Stalin placed a ransom of 100,000 rubles on his head, the highest price ever placed on a single German soldier. He received every decoration Germany could award, including being the only recipient of the Knight's Cross with golden oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, the highest military award in Nazi Germany. But Rudel's individual achievements, as remarkable as they were, tell only part of the Stuka's story. The top 58 Stuka pilots on the Eastern Front, those who flew the cannon-armed G variants, collectively claimed the destruction of approximately 3,700 Soviet tanks. These numbers are certainly inflated, as all combat claims are. Tank kills are notoriously difficult to confirm. A tank that appears destroyed may be repaired and returned to service. Multiple pilots may claim the same kill, and pilots operating under extreme stress in rapidly changing combat conditions often genuinely misidentify what they've hit. Historians estimate the actual number of Soviet tanks destroyed by Stukas was probably 30 to 40% of the claimed total, perhaps 1/500 tanks. Even using the conservative estimates, 1/500 tanks destroyed represents a significant military achievement. A Soviet tank division contained 210 tanks. The Stuka pilots destroyed the equivalent of 7 full-strength Soviet tank divisions, and they did it flying an aircraft that was obsolete by every conventional measure. Too slow, too vulnerable, armed with a weapon system consisting of just 12 rounds of ammunition. But in the hands of skilled and determined pilots, operating in close coordination with ground forces, the Stuka proved that precision and training could overcome technological disadvantage. The Stuka also proved the value of specialized weapons. The conventional wisdom was that multi-role fighters were more efficient than specialized attackers. One aircraft that could fight other aircraft, attack ground targets, and perform reconnaissance was more valuable than 3 aircraft, each optimized for a single role. The Stuka proved this wrong, at least in certain circumstances. For the specific mission of destroying tanks, the cannon-armed Stuka was more effective than any fighter bomber of the war. It couldn't dogfight, it couldn't intercept bombers, but it could destroy tanks with a precision and efficiency that nothing else could match. By the end of April 1945, the war was effectively over. Berlin was surrounded. Soviet forces were closing in from all sides. Most Luftwaffe units had been destroyed or had ceased operations due to lack of fuel, but Stuka units kept flying. The last recorded Stuka combat mission was flown on May 8, 1945, the day Germany surrendered. A lone Ju-87 attacked Soviet forces near Prague. It was the end of a story that had begun in Spain 8 years earlier. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka flew more combat missions than any other German aircraft type. Over 6,500 Stukas were produced. They equipped 28 Geschwaders at their peak. They operated on every front where Germany fought, from Norway to North Africa, from the Atlantic to the Urals. They sank 19 warships and thousands of smaller vessels. They destroyed or damaged countless tanks, vehicles, bridges, and installations, but their true impact cannot be measured in statistics alone. The Stuka revolutionized close air support. Before the Stuka, tactical air power meant strafing and light bombing by fighters or level bombing by medium bombers. Neither was particularly effective. The Stuka showed that aircraft could work directly with ground forces in real time, destroying specific targets with surgical precision. Every modern close air support aircraft, from the American A-10 Warthog to the Soviet Su-25 Frogfoot, owes a debt to the Stuka's pioneering role. The Stuka also proved the importance of psychological warfare. The Jericho trumpets had no tactical value. They made the aircraft slightly slower and used weight that could have been devoted to armour or armament. But the terror they induced in enemy troops was a force multiplier. Modern militaries understand this. The sound of an A-10's Ju-8 cannon is distinctive and terrifying to enemy forces. Attack helicopters are painted in aggressive colour schemes designed to intimidate. These are direct descendants of the Stuka's psychological warfare doctrine. Most importantly, the Stuka demonstrated that obsolete does not mean useless. By every measure, the Stuka should have been withdrawn from service by 1942. It was too slow, too vulnerable. Its basic design was 10 years old. Newer aircraft were available, but in the specific conditions of the Eastern Front, the Stuka remained effective until the end of the war, not because it was a great aircraft in absolute terms, but because it was perfectly optimized for a specific mission, and the Luftwaffe had pilots trained to fly it superbly. After the war, Hans-Ulrich Rudel fled to Argentina where he lived for decades, never renouncing his Nazi beliefs. He wrote memoirs glorifying his service. He remained unrepentant about fighting for a criminal regime. He died in 1982. The Stukas that survived the war were almost all scrapped. Only a handful exist today in museums. The distinctive scream of the Jericho trumpets faded into history, remembered only by those who had heard it in combat, but the legacy remains. On a frozen Russian airfield in 1941, a handful of pilots flying obsolete aircraft stopped a Soviet tank breakthrough through sheer determination and skill. They proved that courage and precision could accomplish what technology alone could not. They showed that in war the weapon matters less than the warrior wielding it. The story of the Stuka is not a story of German technological superiority or tactical brilliance. It is a story of a flawed weapon used effectively by determined men in desperate circumstances. A reminder that in war, victory often belongs not to those with the best equipment, but to those willing to take the greatest risks. The question that military historians still debate is whether the Stuka's success justified its costs. The aircraft was expensive to produce relative to its capabilities. Each Ju-87 required approximately 20,000 man-hours to manufacture. The specialized training needed to fly it effectively took months, and the losses were staggering. Of the 6,500 Stukas built, approximately 3,800 were destroyed in combat or accidents. That's a loss rate of nearly 60%. By comparison, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter had a loss rate of around 40%. The Stuka was being destroyed faster than almost any other German aircraft type. But raw loss statistics don't tell the complete story. The question isn't how many Stukas were lost, but what was accomplished before they were lost. A single Stuka destroying 10 tanks before being shot down represented a positive exchange ratio. Those 10 tanks cost more to produce than the Stuka. They required trained crews that took longer to replace than a Stuka pilot. And the psychological impact of destroying those tanks affected Soviet operations far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The Soviet perspective on the Stuka is illuminating. Soviet military documents captured after the war show that German air attacks, particularly by Stukas, were consistently rated as more disruptive than equivalent German ground attacks. A Soviet tank battalion commander interviewed in 1944 stated that his unit could handle German tank attacks with reasonable confidence. They understood German armour tactics. They had effective anti-tank weapons. But Stuka attacks created chaos. Tanks would scatter. Communications would break down. Even if only a few tanks were actually destroyed, the entire formation would be disrupted for hours. Soviet anti-aircraft doctrine evolved specifically to counter the Stuka threat. By 1943, every Soviet tank brigade was supposed to have an attached anti-aircraft battalion with at least 12 guns. These were primarily 37mm automatic cannons, effective against low-flying aircraft. but deploying these guns meant reducing the number of regular artillery pieces. Resources devoted to air defense couldn't be used for ground combat. The Stukas were forcing the Soviets to divert significant military capability to a defensive role. The German High Command understood the Stuka's value even as they recognized its limitations. In January 1943, General Feldmarschall Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, specifically requested more Stuka units for his sector. He wrote that conventional fighters performing ground attack missions achieved poor results because they lacked the training and precision for effective tank hunting. He needed specialists. He needed Stukas. The request was approved. 3 additional Stuka Geschwaders were transferred to the southern sector, despite desperate requests for those same aircraft in other theatres. This created tensions within the Luftwaffe's command structure. Hermann Göring wanted to concentrate air power for strategic bombing and air superiority missions. He viewed ground support as a secondary priority, but field commanders like von Manstein insisted that without effective close air support, their ground forces couldn't hold their positions. The debate was never fully resolved. Instead, Stuka units were constantly shuttled from crisis to crisis, never staying in one sector long enough to establish dominance, but always arriving in time to prevent disaster. The Eastern Front's unique characteristics made this fire brigade approach possible. The front lines stretched for over 1,000 miles. Soviet offensives rarely occurred simultaneously along the entire front. Instead, the Soviets would concentrate forces for breakthrough attempts at specific locations. This created a pattern where German commanders could predict roughly where the next crisis would occur. Stuka units would be moved to airfields near the threatened sector, sometimes arriving just hours before Soviet attacks began. This required extraordinary logistical coordination and pilots willing to fly multiple missions immediately after arriving at unfamiliar airfields. One example illustrates the Stuka's role in this operational pattern. In March 1944, Soviet forces launched a major offensive near Târgu Frumos in Romania, attempting to encircle the German Eighth Army. The initial Soviet assault involved over 400 tanks and broke through German defensive positions on a 6-mile front. German reserves were minimal. The sector commander requested immediate air support. Stuka Geschwader II, operating 120 miles away, was ordered to relocate. The unit flew to a forward airfield, landed, refueled, and began attacking the Soviet breakthrough within 4 hours of receiving orders. Over the next 3 days, the Stukas flew 237 sorties against the Soviet tank columns. Hans-Ulrich Rudel personally flew 11 missions in the first day. His squadron claimed 17 tank kills that day, though the actual number was probably closer to 9 or 10 confirmed destructions. But the impact extended beyond the tanks destroyed. Soviet commanders, aware that their columns were under constant air attack, slowed their advance. They dispersed their forces to make them harder to target from the air. They waited for anti-aircraft reinforcements. That delay gave German ground forces time to establish new defensive positions. The Soviet breakthrough was contained. The Eighth Army escaped encirclement. This pattern repeated throughout 1944. Soviet breakthrough, Stuka. Response, delay and disruption. German forces establish new lines. Soviet advance continues, but at a manageable pace. The Stukas couldn't stop the Soviet offensives. The Red Army was too large, too well equipped, and too determined. But the Stukas could slow the advance, buying time for German armies to retreat in good order, rather than being encircled and destroyed. In the desperate defensive warfare of 1944 and 1945, that time was invaluable. The human cost of these operations was extraordinary. Stuka pilots in 1944 were flying an average of 4 to 6 combat missions per day during active operations. Each mission lasted between 45 minutes and 2 hours. Pilots would be in the cockpit for 8 to 12 hours per day, most of that time in combat conditions with adrenaline at maximum. The physical and psychological stress was immense. Pilots developed nervous disorders, stress-induced ailments, and psychological trauma that would later be recognized as combat fatigue or PTSD. Ernst Gerdemann, Rudel's longtime reargunner, described the experience in his post-war memoirs. He wrote that after the first few missions of a day, you stopped being afraid because you were too exhausted to process fear. Your hands moved through the reloading procedures automatically. Your eyes scanned for threats mechanically. You became a machine performing a function. Only later, After landing and the adrenaline faded, would the shaking start? Some pilots couldn't eat, others couldn't sleep. Many drank heavily despite regulations against alcohol consumption. The Luftwaffe tried to rotate pilots out of combat for rest periods. In theory, a pilot would fly intensive combat operations for 6 weeks, then be withdrawn for 2 weeks of rest and retraining. In practice, this rarely happened on the Eastern Front. There were never enough pilots. Units that were supposed to have 18 aircraft might have only 12 operational and only 8 qualified pilots. When someone was withdrawn for rest, their missions had to be flown by someone else, increasing the burden on those who remained. Some pilots broke under the strain. They would develop mysterious mechanical problems with their aircraft before missions. They would become sick with ailments that couldn't be medically verified. A few simply refused to fly. The Luftwaffe's response was harsh. Pilots who refused combat duty could be court-martialed and executed. During the war, approximately 40 German pilots were executed for cowardice or desertion. The actual number who broke down but weren't executed is unknown. Many were quietly reassigned to non-combat roles, or discharged for medical reasons to avoid the stigma of cowardice charges. Hans Ulrich Rudel somehow avoided this psychological breakdown. Various theories have been proposed. Some historians suggest his fanatical Nazi ideology provided psychological armour, giving him a sense of purpose that sustained him through the horror. Others point to his physical fitness regimen and abstinence from alcohol and tobacco as factors that maintained his mental resilience. Still others suggest he was simply wired differently, possessing an unusual psychological makeup that allowed him to compartmentalize trauma. Whatever the reason, he continued flying when others collapsed. By early 1945, the Stuka's obsolescence had become terminal. Soviet fighters dominated the skies. The Ak-3 could reach 400 miles per hour. The Stuka's maximum speed was 255 miles per hour. When Soviet fighters appeared, Stukas died. German fighter escorts became essential for survival, but by 1945 there weren't enough fighters. Fuel shortages grounded entire Luftwaffe units. Pilots were undertrained because the Reich couldn't spare fuel for proper flight instruction. The few combat-ready fighters had to prioritize defending German cities from American and British bomber streams. Stuka units adapted by flying at dawn and dusk when Soviet fighters were less active. They flew at extremely low altitude, sometimes just feet off the ground, where they were difficult to spot and intercept. They used terrain features for cover, approaching targets through valleys or behind tree lines. These tactics reduced losses but also reduced effectiveness. Low-altitude attacks gave pilots less time to acquire targets and line up attacks. Accuracy suffered. The industrial situation was equally dire. By January 1945, Stuka production had effectively ended. The Junkers factories were being bombed by Allied aircraft. Raw materials were unavailable. The few Stukas still being assembled were using parts cannibalized from damaged aircraft. Repair depots worked miracles keeping existing aircraft flying, but every loss was permanent. A Stuka shot down in March 1945 couldn't be replaced. The pilot might be replaced, though pilot training had also collapsed, but the aircraft was gone forever. Yet the missions continued. In the final months of the war, Stuka pilots flew knowing they probably wouldn't survive the year. The war was clearly lost. Germany's cities were in ruins. Soviet armies were advancing into Germany itself. But the pilots kept flying. Some flew from loyalty to their comrades. If they didn't fly, someone else would have to fly their missions. Some flew from duty, a sense that their role was to protect German soldiers on the ground regardless of strategic futility. Some flew simply because they knew nothing else. They had been combat pilots for 3 or 4 years. Flying was their identity. The final recorded combat missions of the Stuka demonstrate this desperate determination. On May 7, 1945, with Germany's surrender imminent, Stuka Geschwader II was operating from a field near Prague. Soviet forces had entered the city. German forces were trying to retreat westward to surrender to American rather than Soviet forces. The Stukas flew cover for the retreat, attacking Soviet positions that threatened to cut off the withdrawing columns. Hans Ulrich Rudel flew his last combat mission that day. He attacked Soviet tanks near Prague, claiming 2 kills, though no confirmation exists. His Stuka was hit by anti-aircraft fire but remained flyable. He landed at an American-controlled airfield in Bavaria and surrendered to American forces. The war ended for him without the dramatic last stand he might have wished for. Just a final mission, a damaged aircraft, and surrender to avoid Soviet captivity. The question that haunts historians is whether the Stuka's success came despite its obsolescence or because of it. The paradox is that the Stuka's limitations forced a doctrine that maximized its effectiveness. Because it was slow, it had to attack at low altitude where its accuracy was highest. Because it was vulnerable, it had to be used surgically at decisive points rather than wasted on marginal targets. Because it required skilled pilots, those pilots received intensive training that made them vastly more effective than average fighter pilots performing ground attack missions. A thought experiment illuminates this. Suppose Germany had developed a modern fighter bomber in 1941, something comparable to the American P-47 Thunderbolt or the British Typhoon. Fast, heavily armed, capable of both air superiority and ground attack. Would such aircraft have been more effective than the Stuka on the Eastern Front? Possibly not. The speed advantage would matter less in ground attack where you need to slow down to acquire targets. The heavier armament might not compensate for reduced accuracy, and critically, the multi-role capability would mean the aircraft was frequently diverted to other missions when ground support was needed. The Stuka's obsolescence was its protection from diversion. Nobody was going to use Stukas for strategic bombing or air superiority missions. They were useless for those roles, so they remained concentrated in their specialized ground attack role where they excelled. Resources were devoted to training pilots specifically for that mission. Tactics were developed without concern for other applications. In organizational terms, the Stuka's limitations created clarity of purpose that more capable aircraft lacked. This principle has implications beyond World War II military history. In any complex system, specialization versus versatility involves trade-offs that aren't obvious. The specialist tool may be useless for most tasks, but optimal for its specific function. The versatile tool can handle many tasks but may be optimal for none. Modern military forces still struggle with this balance. Should you develop specialized aircraft for close air support or use multi-role fighters? Both approaches have merit depending on circumstances. The Stuka also demonstrated that psychological factors in warfare can equal or exceed material factors. The rational analysis suggested the Stuka should have been withdrawn after the Battle of Britain. The loss rates were unsustainable. The vulnerability was fatal, but the psychological impact on enemy forces justified continued deployment. Soviet soldiers feared Stukas more than they feared tanks. That fear affected their combat performance in ways that don't appear in statistics, but were tactically significant. Modern militaries have internalized this lesson, though often unconsciously. The American A-10 Warthog, designed in the 1970s for close air support against Soviet armor, is fundamentally a Stuka successor. It's relatively slow compared to modern fighters. It's vulnerable to sophisticated air defenses. Multiple attempts have been made to retire it, but it remains in service because ground forces trust it. The distinctive sound of its cannon and its reputation for accuracy creates psychological effects that newer, more capable aircraft don't replicate. The parallel to the Stuka is precise. The final legacy of the Stuka is more troubling. Hans Ulrich Rudel's post-war life casts a shadow over the aircraft's story. He never renounced Nazism. He maintained connections with neo-Nazi groups. He provided tactical advice to right-wing dictatorships in South America. His memoirs glorified warfare and promoted militaristic ideology. And because he was the most famous Stuka pilot, his story became the Stuka's story. The aircraft became associated with his politics. This association is historically unfortunate but politically inevitable. The Stuka was a weapon of Nazi Germany. It supported armies that committed genocide. It enabled military campaigns that caused immeasurable suffering. These facts cannot be separated from technical discussions of its effectiveness. Any analysis of the Stuka must acknowledge that its success served monstrous ends. Yet thousands of men flew Stukas who weren't Rudel. Men who were conscripted rather than volunteers. Men who fought because they believed they were defending their homeland. Men who rejected Nazi ideology, but served because refusing meant death. Their stories are lost in Rudel's shadow, subsumed into a narrative where all German soldiers were either heroes or villains depending on your perspective. The reality was more complex. Most were simply men caught in circumstances beyond their control, trying to survive. The ground crews who kept the Stukas flying deserve particular recognition. Mechanics worked through Russian winters in conditions that froze exposed flesh in minutes. Armourers loaded bombs and ammunition under fire. Fuel crews hand-pumped avgas in sub-zero temperatures. These men weren't flying the missions, they weren't earning decorations. But without their work, the Stukas stayed grounded. A pilot might fly 6 missions in a day. His ground crew worked for 20 hours straight, making those missions possible. One ground crew member, whose name was not recorded, wrote a letter home in December 1943 that was later captured and translated by Soviet intelligence. He described working on an aircraft that had been shot up by anti-aircraft fire. There were 47 holes in the fuselage and wings. The hydraulic system was completely destroyed. The landing gear wouldn't retract. Regulations said the aircraft should be written off and scrapped for parts, but they needed every aircraft. So the crew worked through the night, fabricating parts from other damaged aircraft, rigging the hydraulic system with manual controls, and patching the holes with metal from fuel drums. 12 hours later, the aircraft flew another mission. It survived 4 more missions before being destroyed. That level of improvisation characterized Luftwaffe ground operations on the Eastern Front. Nothing worked as designed. Everything required adaptation. Standard procedures were ignored because standard conditions didn't exist. An aircraft manual might specify that engine oil should be a certain viscosity at a certain temperature, but that specification assumed normal European conditions. In Russian winter, that oil turned to sludge. Ground crews learned to use diesel fuel mixed with whatever oil they had, creating makeshift solutions that violated every regulation but kept engines running. The Soviets, facing their own logistical nightmares, developed immense respect for German ground crews. Soviet mechanics, interrogating captured German maintenance personnel, were astounded at the workarounds being used. One Soviet technical officer later wrote that if Soviet ground crews had shown the same initiative and improvisation as their German counterparts, Soviet aircraft availability might have been 30% higher. But Soviet military culture emphasized following procedures and regulations, which worked well in stable conditions but poorly in chaos. This cultural difference extended to pilot training and tactics. Soviet pilots were trained to follow doctrine strictly. Formation flying was rigid. Attack patterns were predictable. This made Soviet forces easier to coordinate at scale but reduced individual effectiveness. German pilots, particularly Stuka pilots, were given far more tactical freedom. A flight leader might be told to attack Soviet positions in a specific area but had complete authority over how the attack was conducted. This flexibility allowed German pilots to exploit opportunities and adapt to changing conditions. The cost of this flexibility was that it required more skilled pilots. You couldn't hand a Stuka to a barely trained recruit and expect good results. The aircraft demanded precision. The tactics required judgment. Rudel's success came partly from his fanatical dedication to perfecting his skills, but also from a training system that gave him the time and resources to develop those skills. By 1944, that training system had collapsed. New Stuka pilots arriving at frontline units had perhaps 50 hours of flight time total. They were expected to learn in combat. Most didn't survive long enough to learn. The final months of the war saw Stuka units composed of a few experienced pilots flying, the majority of missions, while new pilots flew minimal sorties and often were lost on their first or second missions. One Stuka squadron in March 1945 had 3 pilots with over 500 missions each, 2 pilots with about 100 missions, and 8 pilots with fewer than 10 missions. The experienced pilots flew 5 or 6 missions per day. The novices flew 1 or 2 and frequently failed to return. This created a vicious cycle. Experienced pilots were exhausted but kept flying because novices couldn't perform effectively. Novices weren't learning because they weren't surviving long enough. The squadron's overall effectiveness declined even though the veterans maintained their individual performance. It was organizational collapse from the bottom up, held together only by the determination of a handful of men who refused to stop fighting. When the war ended, the surviving Stuka pilots faced uncertain futures. Some surrendered to Western allies and were released relatively quickly. Others were captured by Soviet forces and disappeared into the Gulag system. The lucky ones died in camps. The unlucky ones survived and weren't released until the 1950s. Soviet treatment of captured Luftwaffe personnel was particularly harsh because Soviet soldiers remembered the terror of Stuka attacks. Being a Stuka pilot in Soviet captivity was a death sentence or worse. The Stukas themselves were almost entirely destroyed. A few aircraft were captured intact and tested by Allied intelligence services. The Americans were particularly interested in the cannon-armed G variant, conducting detailed evaluations of its anti-tank capabilities. British intelligence tested the Jericho trumpets, measuring sound frequency and amplitude. Soviet technicians completely disassembled captured Stukas, studying their construction and design philosophy. But by 1946, nearly all surviving Stukas had been scrapped. The aluminum was valuable, the engines could be salvaged. There was no reason to preserve them. Only 2 or 3 complete Ju-87s exist today in museums. Several others are partial reconstructions using parts from multiple aircraft. Flying examples don't exist, though some museums have conducted restoration projects aimed at eventually achieving airworthy status. The scarcity of surviving examples means that modern understanding of the Stuka comes primarily from photographs, combat footage, and documentation rather than physical examination. The historical assessment of the Stuka remains contentious. German sources, particularly those written by former Luftwaffe personnel, emphasize the aircraft's effectiveness and the skill of its pilots. Soviet sources acknowledge the Stuka's impact but stress that improved air defences eventually neutralized the threat. Western historians debate whether the Stuka's tactical success justified its strategic costs. All these perspectives contain elements of truth and elements of bias. What seems clear is that the Stuka succeeded in its designed role longer than any contemporary believed possible. An aircraft declared obsolete in 1940 remained effective until 1945, 5 full years. It achieved this longevity not through technological superiority, but through specialized optimization and tactical adaptation. The Stuka was never a great aircraft in absolute terms, but in specific circumstances, flown by skilled pilots against appropriate targets, it was devastatingly effective. The lesson transcends military history. Organizations facing technological change often assume that newer automatically means better, but effectiveness depends on matching capabilities to requirements. An old tool perfectly suited to its task may outperform a newer, more advanced tool being used inappropriately. The Stuka proved this principle at a cost measured in thousands of aircraft and thousands of lives. Whether that cost was justified depends on ethical and strategic judgments that history hasn't resolved and perhaps never will.